Okay, so let's talk about behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology. Okay, behavior genetics. What are we talking about? Um, in behavior genetics, the goal is to predict individual differences from a person's heredity combined with their environment. So this isn't purely about genetics. It's about genetics combined with the environmental influences that we all experience. The thing about behavior genetics that's really useful is that it's attempting to explain what makes all of us different from each other, what makes us all unique, so that even though we were raised by the same parents, let's say us and our sibling, even though we were raised by the same person, we don't all end up the same, right? Even though we might have inherited the same genes, we don't end up the same. So let's talk a little bit about genes. Of course, you all know that genes are the building blocks of our heredity. You know that that our genes are the blueprint for how our bodies are designed and things like that, right? Those of you who have had like really elaborate biology classes might want to, fast forward over this part of the lecture, because I'm going to sort of truncate it down for, the psychologist's perspective. So here we have a cell, and inside the cell's nucleus is the chromosomes that contain your genes, and your genes are made up of DNA. The thing about genes is that, for a long time we thought they were sort of I don't know if I want to use the word stagnant, but sort of consistent, that you inherit what you inherit and you have to express or not express those things depending on dominance and recessiveness and like that. But now we're realizing that genes are more responsive to the environment than people used to think. That you have genes in you that are turned on and become active, or turn off and become inactive based on feedback from the environment, and then also based on what other genes are present. So just having a gene for something does not necessarily mean that you're going to express the trait that that gene carries. So it's really important to keep that in mind, because especially when we get into psychological disorders, this is going to become really important, because if you have a family member who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, which we think those things are largely genetically determined, being related to somebody with one of those disorders does not mean, A, for sure you carry that same gene that they carry, and B, it does not mean that you've had the same environmental exposures that cause that gene to turn on and have its effect, or that you carry the other genes that help to ensure that that gene turned on and had its effect. So, and this will be relevant when we get to personality theory also. When we talk about certain personality traits being genetic, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be expressed in the individual. It just means that they might be present, and that given the proper circumstances and conglomeration of other genes in the DNA, that you will then express that trait. It's not a guarantee you'll express the trait. All right. One of our favorite things to do in psychology is to try to parse out what role genes play and what role the environment plays in different outcomes. One of the best ways to figure that out is to study twins, identical twins or fraternal twins or regular siblings. An identical twin pair occurs when one sperm fertilizes one egg, and at some point during development, before birth, well, during the embryonic stage, the blastocyst divides into two separate individuals instead of staying within its shell and staying one individual. For some reason, it divides into two. One theory is that there's a code in the sperm, because identical twins seem to run down dad's side of the family, but they also have a certain randomness to them where they just sort of appear. So we're not exactly sure what causes some fertilized eggs to split into two individuals. Once they split into two individuals, they implant into the uterus separately and go on to develop into two separate individuals. One of the things that is critical for you to be an identical twin is that you and your sibling have to be the same sex, because you started out as the same set of chromosomes and genes and DNA, that includes the sex genes, the X and the Y chromosomes. So you have 100% of the time, to be an identical twin, you have to be the same sex. Fraternal, 100% of our genes are shared in identical twins because you started off as one fertilized egg that then split. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, occur when mom released more than one egg in a menstrual cycle in her ovulation, and both of them, or all three of them, or whatever were present, all got fertilized in that same cycle and implanted and made it to the end. Those are called fraternal twins. They're called fraternal because it means brotherly. It's the same thing as being a regular sibling, except for that you shared the womb at the same time. So you've got two individuals that are basically just regular siblings, but they're sharing an environment from the very get-go. In fraternal twins, it's just like any sibling pair. Could be the same sex or they could be the opposite sex. The big difference between fraternal and identical twins is that on average, fraternal twins share about 50% of their genes. Identical twins always share 100% of their genes. Okay, now what's interesting is, remember on the last slide I was just telling you that things can turn your genes on and off. For identical twins, that's true too, and so sometimes identical twins don't have exactly identical outcomes because their genes have been turned on or off based on different things. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's just say identical twins share 100% of their genes, fraternal twins share 50% of their genes, just like regular siblings do. Okay, so knowing that, researchers have studied identical twins and compared them to fraternal twins. This way, by focusing on twins rather than including regular siblings or whatever, we can say, okay, from the time you were conceived, everything was pretty much the same for you as far as environment, right? And then from the time you were born, your environments have been pretty similar, also in the sense that you're the same age as your sibling. In the twin studies where we're examining twins, they always limit the twins to being the same sex. That way you get rid of the confound of fraternal twins not necessarily being the same sex. To be a fraternal twin included in a study, you'd have to be a same-sex pair. So everything's the same environmentally and things like that. The only real difference will be that identical twins share 100% of their genes in common and fraternals share 50%. Okay. So knowing that, identical twins in these studies have proven to be more alike than fraternals in personality traits. Now, when we talk about personality traits, a lot of times, regular lay people talk about personality a little bit differently than psychologists do. We're usually talking exclusively about extroversion, which is, how sociable you are, how much you like to be around other people, how much you enjoy loud music, stuff like that. That's extroversion. So personality traits such as extroversion, and then neuroticism. Neuroticism, there's really no flattering term that psychologists use for what this means. You've got neuroticism as one term. You guys might know what neurotic means, so that doesn't sound very flattering. Emotional instability, that doesn't sound very good either, because it makes it sound like you might be ready to go off the deep end. That's not what it means either. I always just like to use the word moodiness to sort of give us a layman's term for neuroticism, because it's really about, neuroticism is really about how much your moods change across the day, how easily they are affected by stimuli in your environment, stuff like that. So personality traits are more similar in identicals than fraternals, and then really interestingly, behaviors and different kinds of outcomes, like divorce rate. Once these kids grow into adulthood, their divorce rates will tend to match more if they're identical twins than if they're fraternal twins. The hobbies that they engage in, their career paths, things like that tend to match more when they are identical than when they are fraternal. Abilities tend to match more when you're an identical. So, for example, your score on an intelligence test. If you know the score of one of the identical twins, you will be correct if you will 90% of the time you will be correct if you just assume that the other twin will have the same score. They tend to match. So a lot of very basic things match between identicals more than they do between fraternals. So that kind of implies that genes play a pretty big role in these factors, because we've tried to hold everything else stable. You know, they are pairs of individuals who shared the womb from conception, and the ones who had more genetic overlap were more similar to each other than the ones who had less genetic overlap. Let's go back to this picture for a second, though. Notice that in the top picture, the identicals share, again, I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse, but I'm gesturing at the red blob that the babies appear to be attached to. That's the placenta. Their umbilical cords are coming up from the placenta. And then you'll notice that each of them is in their own little white amniotic sac. It's like a balloon drawn around the babies. This is a very stereotypical presentation for identical twins, to share a placenta but be in their own amniotic sac. That happens probably 50% of the time. You have babies who are in their own amniotic sacs but attached to the same placenta. In fact, that used to be the way that they would diagnose whether you were identical or fraternal. If you were a same-sex pair, the doctor would know that you had to be identical if you shared a placenta. You'll notice over here on the picture of the fraternals, each baby has their own placenta and their own amniotic sac. Because fraternal twins start off as separate fertilized eggs, they always have different placentas. They always form their own connection to their moms. Because identical twins start off as one fertilized egg, it's a matter of how soon they split into two individuals that determines whether they share a placenta or not, whether they are in one amniotic sac or not. So let's kind of go through the little pattern. Like I said, the pattern that you're seeing on the screen right now for identicals happens in about half of the identical twins. Some identical twins will split earlier, and they'll end up looking like fraternal twins. They'll have their own placenta and their own amniotic sac. Their experience in the uterus, in the womb, will be more individualized than the ones who share a placenta. Identical twins who split later will not only share the placenta, but will also be inside the same amniotic sac. And you can imagine that that's an even more similar uterine environment for those individuals, because they're floating in the same fluid. The latest split, if you split even later than that, you'll have the same placenta, same amniotic sac, and you'll still be connected to each other at some body part, right? So those are called conjoined twins. So in the studies I'm reporting, they don't include conjoined twins, but they really didn't take into account the variations in identical twin connection in the womb. And some people are starting to recognize that that early information that might have been shared for identical twins who shared a placenta, and even more so shared an amniotic sac, that shared information may have shaped their brains to be more similar to each other, that it's an environmental impact rather than a genetic one, but that it's a very early environmental impact. That if we separate, one hypothesis is that if we were to separate out identical twins who had separate placenta from those who shared a placenta, from those who shared a placenta and amniotic sac, we'd probably start to figure out that environment plays a bigger role. Those studies are still ongoing. We haven't got data on them, but that's the hypothesis, that maybe early environmental influences are really important in shaping the brain. And so maybe it's not about the genes being similar in producing these outcomes, but instead just really super early environmental influence. Now if we want to look at the question from the other direction, so if we look at twins, we're talking about people who shared the womb with more or less genetic influence. What if we looked at it from the other angle? What if we looked at people who shared an environment but no genetic similarity at all? So if we looked at kids who were adopted into a family versus the siblings that they were raised with, who were the biological children of the parents or who were other adoptees. So here we have the household as the environment, and then we have the kids who are being raised within that household but who do not have any genetic overlap. How much role does the environment play in that scenario? Well, it turns out that adoptive children are much less like their adoptive parents on all of these traits that I mentioned here: personality, behaviors, abilities. They're much less like their adoptive parents than they are like their biological parents, especially if you test them once they have gotten to about the age of 16. So biology seems to win out over the long run, that your biological predisposition for intelligence or personality traits or skills and abilities or whatever seems to be more influenced by your genes based on these adoptive studies than they are on your environment. When you're little, it looks like the environment's having a pretty big influence. So if we focus only on kids who are between 3 and 10, it looks like the environment's having a pretty big influence. But all that stuff starts to fall away by the time kids are about 16, and their environment stops being a good predictor of their outcomes, and their genes tend to be a better predictor of their outcomes. Now, what about parents? So genes are everything, right? No, genes are not everything. Parenting really does matter. The things that we teach our kids from the get-go are things like religious beliefs, values, manners, attitudes about things, political opinions, habits they engage in, sort of stylistic stuff. So yeah, kids may come into the world with a predisposition towards certain personality traits and behaviors and abilities and things like that. But parents shape the nuance that makes them into individuals. So there's been a big debate. In fact, I'm currently reading an article in Psychology Today right now as I'm making this audio tape. It's August of 2014. And I'm reading an article in Psychology Today about parenting and whether it really matters and who's more important, your peers or your parents. The thing is, early influences on kids from their parents influence what those kids, once they've grown up, want to do with their own kids and how they want to live their lives and stuff like that. So yes, parenting influences a lot of the big basic approaches to the world that kids will express. But a lot of talents and abilities and things like that are laid down in the genes and are only moderately impacted by environmental influences. We'll talk about personality more, we'll talk about intelligence more when we get to those chapters, and we'll revisit some of these issues. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll talk about something that's really important in psychology: the interaction of genes and environment.